What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello, and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that highlights leadership. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the leader of Plaid Cymru. And as soon as we find out who that is, we'll send them an invite. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from the state of the markets and London stocks to the electorate having their say at the ballot box. And of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Stuart Harris, the Managing Director of Stuart Harris Associates. Stuart has been a practicing accountant for almost 30 years. Over the course of his career, he has worked with a wide range of clients and brings his wealth of experience to his current clients. We discuss the current challenges facing the market, and especially those for small businesses. We'll also delve into what can be done to simplify the tax system, business rates and rents, before looking at what the future should have in store. Stuart, welcome.
Hi there, Jonathan.
Look,
nice to talk to you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for coming on today. We've probably got quite a bit we can talk about, and I thought though it might be quite a nice place to start, especially for the listeners. Is perhaps, Stuart, if you could perhaps talk about your background a little briefly, and when it is and why it is you decided to make the decision to start your own business.
Actually, I think, starting at the end, that's actually a very British thing to do. I think British people traditionally like being their own bosses. I think it's a cultural thing. I think on the continent, people prefer to be employed, but we British like to be our own bosses. So my background actually is I'm originally from South London, which also means I'm a Chelsea supporter. That may get a few comments. But I was originally with a family business in South London. My father's business. My brother was also part of the business. So that's really how I learned my trade as an accountant. And then about 20 years ago, when I got married, I emigrated up to North London. I had to start with, I was travelling down to South London, and actually that became a bit difficult when the kids came along. But I had a couple of jobs. I had a partnership which didn't quite work out. So actually that's what made me decide to set up on my own. I'm talking to you from a loft conversion office. I'm very high-tech, very state-of-the-art. And it's also something I see a lot with my clients. A lot of people are working from home nowadays, and the technology is absolutely fantastic. I can't praise it highly enough.
And I think that's something we'll certainly get into a bit more detail about in a bit. And I think you're entirely right about perhaps and you just look at the stats about the number of self-employed people in this country compared to the continent. But of course, you started this now in 10 years ago, and I'm sure that's flown by, in 2009, not exactly known for being the most stable of years economically. How were those early years of the business, and when you had started out with this, what was working in those circumstances like?
I think you're quite right. I think it was difficult setting up on my own. Obviously, I've got experience in the profession, so I had some grounding behind me. But actually, like everybody, in fact, one of the things I said to my wife was, at the time I was concerned there was lots of accountants, and I was thinking, well, will there be enough work for me? And I did actually say to my wife, look, if it doesn't work out, I'll get a job. I had a mortgage to pay and kids to feed. So basically, I went through all the sort of normal processes that anybody starting up in business thinks about. But I think the bottom line is sometimes you've just got to go for it. I think you've got to do your research carefully. as to what you want to do and how you want to do it. But then also, once you've done that and you can make an informed decision, I think sometimes you've just got to go for it. And again, that's sort of going back to this British thing about setting up your own business and being your own boss.
Without a doubt. And since you have actually brought it up, I'll mention as well, the last 10 years has seen a lot of change, not just in the economy, but indeed how it's possible for small business owners and independent outfits to operate, not least the change in technology. And it's especially given the sector you're in, Stuart, it has made things, and had you asked us 20 years ago about the capabilities you could do from a home office, you probably wouldn't believe your future self. How has that technology affected the way you do business?
Well, because of my age, I've basically seen it all. When I started off in the profession, we were doing analysis work on paper. Calculators, computers came in, spreadsheets. The software that I use now, I use professional software from a company called Iris, and it's absolutely fantastic. So what now happens is software is so powerful, it does what I call the number crunching side quickly and efficiently, and then it gives me what I call thinking time at the end of the job to review the work, to look at the bigger picture. And that really does help me to help my clients. In fact, with the technology, it sounds strange, but actually, as high tech as we are, it actually enables me to provide what I consider to be an old-fashioned service.
Without a doubt, it's almost a bit of a paradox, really. But it's something certainly that people in a decade where technology has become so much more advanced, the ability for those that they work with and for your clients especially, being able to know that there's actually a human with empathy and a brain at the other end of it means so much, I think, and that is exceptionally important. Now, Stuart, for many years, you have, of course, been a huge advocate for small businesses. Too often, when legislation is being written, SMEs, the backbone of this country's economy, they don't seem to be at the forefront of everybody's minds. Let's look at the tax system, for example. A good place to start, if any. It clearly needs to be simplified. And I know you've, again, have been working with that and those ideas for a while. Where do we start, Stuart?
It's a tricky one, actually, because I think there's been an office for budgetary simplification for some time. I think there's also a minister of small businesses, although I don't know who he or she is. And I think the problem is when they introduce legislation, they don't look at the bigger picture. I'm absolutely convinced that actually if they did simplify the tax system, people would perceive it as being fairer. I think there'd be less evasion. I think there'd be less avoidance. Or just to clarify, evasion is illegal. Avoidance is fine. That's usually where your accountant is doing certain things to make sure you
never mix
right
those two up.
Right time. Exactly. But people do.
Yes.
Again, some of the high-profile cases, people get on their high horses about certain things. The example of that is with Jimmy Carr and Gary Barlow. I thought it was totally wrong for David Cameron to actually mention Jimmy Carr by name in Parliament. In fact, I think there's actually been a case recently where actually the decision, I think, has been overturned. I think it was literally in this last week. But even so, what he was doing was not illegal. Everything he was doing was actually perfectly legal. So I think people are entitled to privacy. That's actually my main point there. But actually, this situation would not have arisen if the system had been a lot simpler and more transparent.
Oh, without a doubt. And indeed, with the problem is, though, of course, for example, the Office of Tax Simplification, which you pulled up, founded almost 10 years ago in 2010. They submitted 2 reports in 2011. They're still going. I think by the Finance Act 2016, they've become, they're put on a statutory footing, essentially. But I can't. Stuart, can you name me any recommendations they've put forward to actually simplify the tax system since 2011? No, and that's not a problem. I don't know what is.
I can give you another bugbear of something that I see quite frequently with small businesses. It's the question of whether to trade as a company or to trade in your own name as a sole trader. And people say all sorts of daft things. It's not fair that people get away with such and such if they're trading through a company, without necessarily realising it's not black and white. So if you've got a company, actually there are risks attached to that. But actually very often, if the business or if the company is doing well, you then start employing people, so actually that is benefiting the country. So there's all sorts of little issues here that nobody ever really talks about properly, and it gets sort of pushed to one side. We're in the middle of an election now, and both sides really are sort of making all sorts of grand announcements without really looking at the bigger picture. And also the bottom line to all of this is I think that small businesses make up a huge proportion of the business world. And actually, you've been talking about the last 10 years or so, and actually, really, when things have happened, like the banking crisis, small businesses have just got on with it. I think they are the engine of the UK economy.
Absolutely.
And actually, they don't really get much of a say, apart from when we do get our opportunity to have a vote on things. But I think small businesses are quite hard done by, and a lot of rubbish is spoken about them.
And it's extraordinary, and I think it's important to bring in some stats to really prove the point. We all know that SMEs employ around 60% of the British workforce, 60, and for all business turnover in the country, it's over half. So the importance of them really cannot be overstated.
No, exactly. And actually, another thing that fuels it is technology again. So going back to that, small businesses, I think, are thriving because of technology. But then the thing holding them back is some of the daft tax laws that we've got.
Yes. Then let's move beyond the tax system. Whilst we could talk about it all day, we are in the midst of a general election. We speak during it, so that's everybody's Christmas ruined. But we've already had the Labour manifesto released, which didn't go down too well with anybody either running a business or is indeed employed by a business. But we have had some sneak peeks at perhaps the Conservative manifesto, which is yet to be released as we speak. It looks like they will increase the employment allowance from £3,000 to £4,000 and increase the R&D tax credit rate from 12% to 13%. And I think these will be welcome, but I think the perhaps the elephant in the room is going to be what's going to be done with business rates. Now,
yes.
So I would love to know what you think and what you hope would happen on that front.
Again, looking back historically, it's been suggested years ago that we should have some sort of local income tax. But again, nobody's actually ever grasped the nettle to actually look at it properly. The example I think, we've spoken a little bit about people working from home. So again, I'm in that situation. I'm speaking to you from a loft office. So because what I do is clerical, I don't get charged business rates. Now, I can also see it from the other side, and I've literally just had a meeting this morning with a client. So they need to have a high street presence, and they're getting clobbered. It's actually two things. It's business rates is one thing, and also rents. So business rents are sort of controlled by a small number of landlords in the high street, and basically they almost have a monopoly situation and a blackmail situation to get higher rents than perhaps they deserve. And then on the business rate side, people are getting clobbered unfairly. They're bearing the brunt of the business rates bill, whereas people like myself haven't got to pay anything. So I think that's unfair. I actually think I should be paying something to contribute to local services. But nobody actually wants to look at it properly to work out what would be a fair system.
No, I think that half of that is that sometimes I feel that they just don't want to rock the boat. But if the boat's got a hole in it, something's got to be done, isn't it? Now, let's say I'll put you on the spot perhaps here, Stuart. Let's say you had the chance to write two policies for the next for that manifesto. What would you prioritise? What would you put in it?
I think it's probably the two things we've just spoken about. I'd really like to have a go at simplifying the tax system. I'd really like to take a very big axe and chop a load of stuff out. And then business rates. I would like to sit down with someone and work out what is a better system. Basically, just to spread the load. We all know with any tax system, we all know we've got to pay something towards services. It's so higgledy-piggledy. That's the problem. So to be honest, I'm angling for a peerage and to be made Minister of Small Businesses. And actually, I'd like to take a pretty strong attitude to simplifying the whole system.
Well, I think is what you'll offer, Stuart, is a exceptionally robust defence of small business, which we've had some ministers of small business before that, of course, famously never run a small business, which you can't help but feel is a bit tragic, really.
We've got a lot of career politicians who don't really know anything about business. Again, it's difficult to comment. I'll put in a good word for my own local MP, who's Teresa Villiers, who actually has been in business. I think she's very intelligent and also a good MP. But it does seem to be patchy in Parliament.
Absolutely. She's worked obviously with the Review many a time, and it's telling that there are less and less members and candidates that have a real world experience. There are so many people, and I'm sure this has always been said, but the numbers really do back it up now, in that even on the front benches, officer class as it were, often they are people who on the Labour side it tends to be coming out of university, working for a student union or a trade union, and then becoming an MP. And on the Tory side it's often working for CCHQ, the local party, and then becoming an MP. What good that does for legislation is probably not a lot.
One thing I've also noticed, a slightly different point. So again, yes, experience in business is important, but also there doesn't seem to be in Parliament people with gravitas. So I'm talking again. I'm talking for the Parliamentary Review. You've got Lord Blunkett and you've got Lord Pickles, who actually are. I've met them both, and they are both men that you listen to them and you respect them, even if actually you disagree with anything they have gravitas. They are statesmen and should be respected. They don't seem to be people like that in Parliament at the moment.
What is it? It's entirely right. And what is interesting is that when the next Parliament is elected, assuming Theresa May holds Maidenhead, which let's assume away, shall we? She will be the only ex-Prime Minister in the chamber. Sajid Javid, who led us... we shouldn't assume anything in these elections anymore, should we? But if the Tories were to win, Sajid Javid will probably remain the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There will be no ex-Chancellors in the House of Commons. Which is usually up until at least 10 years ago, you could count on there being a couple of ex-chancellors, ex-home secretaries, ex-prime ministers in the chamber, and it was very useful to have those senior members there.
Yeah, but I don't know if Lords fulfills any of that at all. Again, Lord Blunkett and Lord Pickles are in the House of Lords. I don't know if there's other peers as well who do have some say in what government gets up to and whether they're consulted when there's difficult issues. But there does, again, we've had a logjam because of Brexit.
Yes,
that hasn't helped.
Well, I tell you what,
we seem to need.
You brought it up. I didn't want to say it first, but I think I know where you're going with this, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we have this issue now, don't we, where for 3.5 years we have, it seems as a country, to be able to talk about nothing else, and it sucked the energy away from policy discussing.
Yes. I think you're quite right. And that's actually also what I'm getting into with, my wanting to simplify the tax system, with wanting to reform business rent and rate. Nobody's had a chance to look at that. Although actually, in fact, to be fair, I think even before that, nobody was looking at it properly. But actually, I don't think government has been governing for the last 3.5 years. It's really, as you say, everything's been taken up by Brexit, and that has to be wrong as well. The delay, as much as anything, I think has been just as harmful as any. I think my attitude is actually, if we'd stayed in the EU, there would have been disruption, and by leaving the EU, there's going to be disruption, but also the delay. So actually, all three ways, there's going to be some sort of disruption. But I think delay is never a good thing. I don't think businesses or business markets like uncertainty and delay.
Oh, absolutely. I think the hope is, and I don't know how much longer this can last for, with if there's another delay. Let's hope not for business' sake, but it's not a case of necessarily people investing their money elsewhere. It's just the case of them sitting on it.
Yeah.
And so we hope that if and however this is resolved, and let's hope it is very soon, this election result dependent, we will see the taps turned back on, as it were.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of business in the pipeline that's not being done because of the delays. I mean, I'll tell you a slightly cheeky one. Yes. I may change my car next year. But actually, the way things are going, I'm almost certainly not going to buy a German car if they keep messing us around.
Well, quite. And that's, actually on that point, whether it's relatively individualistic consumer decisions like buying a car, or whether it's a multinational investing, the money isn't going to New York. The money isn't going to Berlin or Frankfurt or Paris. It is very much just waiting for a decision from the politicians. But as you've said already, Stuart, it's small businesses that really run the show, and they have been exceptionally resilient throughout this entire process, and haven't shown nearly as much panic as some of the larger companies. Stuart, I'm conscious of the time. I would just ask, what are your predictions for the next 12 months?
Ooh, that's a tricky one.
Yes.
Hold on, I've just put my crystal ball away, so I'll have to get it back out again. I think first things first, we need some sort of decisive result in the election. I think that will help matters. I think we do need some sort of clear out in Parliament. I think whatever you think of Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn, I think we do need a period of someone actually doing something decisive. That's probably why I favour Boris rather than Jeremy. But I think we need a period of stability as well. I think whatever business is in the pipeline needs to be done. I think that needs to happen in the next 12 months. I think, as I said, going back to what I've just said, I think the delay is an issue, and I think we need to get past that and basically start working and trading.
Yes, there was a poll out just yesterday that said about 3/4 of Brits want there to be a majority in Parliament. I think you speak on behalf of an awful lot of individuals and businesses. Stuart, lastly, probably most importantly, Chelsea, where will they be finishing?
They're doing well at the moment. They're a young team. I think they'll probably fall away a little bit towards the end of the season.
Top four,
I'm a little bit worried about... I think so, yes. And actually, if they do that, it'll be an achievement. I'm a bit worried with Mourinho going to Spurs now, because I know he's a serial winner, and I think Spurs have got a good team. They're just fallen away a little bit. I must admit, as a football fan, I just want things to be exciting.
Yes.
I don't like it when one team or two teams win everything every year. So, I mean, in fact, I'm not doing Liverpool or Man City down because they're terrific teams, but you want there to be, you want the top teams to be able to beat each other every so often.
Well, I know that obviously Amazon are halfway through making a documentary thing about Spurs this year, so clearly the chaps at Amazon thought it was getting a bit boring, so said, put Mourinho in, mid-season plot twist. Look, Stuart, I hope after the election we can speak again, because who knows, we might be in a completely different circumstance. But now, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. As I said, it's been a pleasure, and as I said, I want a decisive result in the election, and I want Chelsea to win the Premiership.
Don't we all? It's lovely speaking.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Stuart, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector. And whatever else happens, that's at least Stuart is right about Chelsea. Just me? Oh well. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything. But there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push through this bill without wrecking amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December. Something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition that claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? You hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I've found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well, I
was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. And certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you all know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
Yeah, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner-city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry, and I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dialogue Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
That's Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying that the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet. This is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and Warburn. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I've got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think it very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, of 7 years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it's like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you came quite unscathed from it.
I came out, he was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
But it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years. And it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Because thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Marquis of Granby to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.